Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today on the show, I speak with famed ethnobotanist, best-selling author, and conservation advocate, Mark Plotkin. Mark is also the host of a podcast we recommend, Plants of the Gods, where he dives into traditional knowledge, conservation, culture, and healing potential of hallucinogenic plants and fungi. He joins me today to talk about the importance of traditional ecological knowledge, the many valuable plants in the Amazon, the popularization of them, and the positives and negatives from what Mark describes as the current psychedelic renaissance, and what it means for conservation. Mark is also the president and co-founder of the Amazon Conservation Team, which, at the time of its founding, was notably different in its conservation approach in that it put indigenous communities at the center of its conservation strategy, a view that today has gained significant traction. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining me. It's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. I'm a long-standing great fan of Mongabay and all of its manifestations.
We certainly appreciate that. And there's a lot to talk about here. But first, I want to give our audience a primer on what your podcast is about, Plants of the Gods. So can you go ahead and just give our listeners a bit of a background on your podcast and why you started it?
Well, my mentor is Richard Evans Schultes, the so-called father of ethnobotany. This is a fellow who went to Oklahoma as an undergraduate and found peyote. Of course, when ethnobotanists find something, they find something. Schultes always said it's our indigenous guides and teachers who share it with us. So he brought mescaline to the attention of the outside world. 2 years later, doing his graduate work, he was in Oaxaca and found magic mushrooms and psilocybin. So he brought psilocybin to the world in addition to mescaline. And 3 years later, he's in the Sibundoy Valley of Colombia, where my organization, the Amazon Conservation Team, works. And he found ayahuasca and brought that to the world. So I consider that the greatest 5 years in the history of ethnobotany. When Schultes retired from Harvard decades ago, he handed me his lecture notes and said, "It's yours." And I knew that if I didn't do something with those lecture notes, and that was based on the lecture he took as an undergraduate, that course would die with me. So they sat on my shelf for about 15 years with me looking up at them occasionally, what am I going to do with this? And then my two wonderful daughters said, Dad, times have changed. Today's show, TED Talk, that stuff is passé. The name of the game is podcast. So if you want to reach a new audience, a broader audience, a younger audience, podcasts are the way to go. Now, I grew up at an age where there were 3 channels of TV, so you'd have 40 million people watching the news at night. Those channels of communication no longer exist in terms of pulling in that audience. So when I had the chance to talk to you guys on the Mongabay podcast, I jumped at it. By the same token, my podcast, Plants of the Gods, Hallucinogens, Healing, Culture, and Conservation, uses hallucinogens and mind-altering substances as a hook to tell a broader story. It's everything. What plant the American Revolution was based on, hint, it wasn't tea, to medicinal plants and the history of warfare and the Iliad and the Odyssey. So it's not just about how much ayahuasca you take and when, but it's about how mind-altering substances are a cornerstone of the new healing in the age of the psychedelic renaissance, or proof that these rainforests hold compounds that we need and don't know, hallucinogenic and otherwise, and that these indigenous peoples in the Amazon and in Canada and in West Africa know stuff that guys like you and me don't know. So the idea was to put that in front of a broader audience, always in a scientifically accurate and hopefully compelling form.
Well, and so in that spirit, I wanted to talk about the value of this traditional and indigenous knowledge, specifically about hallucinogenic plants. Can you talk about why indigenous knowledge is so fundamental to their application?
Well, I can give an example from the headlines that has nothing to do with hallucinogens. We're all tremendously heartened by this success story of the rescue of these 4 Colombian indigenous kids in the Amazon. They were lost in the rainforest for 40 days, and the oldest was 12 years old. And they survived, at least in part, because they know the lay of the land. And that's everything from what not to eat, to what to eat, to how to keep away from stuff like jaguars and bushmasters. So this manifestation of indigenous wisdom is not just about the shaman giving you stuff to blow your mind and hopefully put it back together. but it is manifest in many ways, medicinal, agricultural, maybe even industrial. Now, hallucinogens are the shaman's medicine par excellence. These are shamanic scalpels, which allow the medicine women and medicine men to explore, diagnose, analyze, treat, and sometimes cure things that Western physicians cannot. Because if a Western physician wants to deal with your brain, she or he sends you to a psychiatrist, which, there's certainly some success stories out there, but there's a lot of failures as well. This means a shaman has other tools and can do something that our doctors cannot without slicing into your skull and your brain matter.
Yeah, your conversation with Dr. Glenn Shepard really dove into this extensively, particularly when you were talking with him about the role of shamans. So I was wondering if you can tell our listeners a bit about the value of shamans and why their work is so critical.
Well, if you look at Western medicine, at least from my perspective, it stands on two pillars. One is the chemistry, what's in the pills, what's in the medicines, and the other is technology, the x-rays, the CAT scans, stuff like that. If you look at shamanic medicine, the overlap is in the chemicals. They're using these plants. Now, the Amazon's got 30,000 species of angiosperms, flowering plants, and probably millions and millions and millions of fungi. Now, if you look at Taxol, which is the anti-cancer superstar, it's supposedly derived from the U in the northwest part of the U.S., we've only recently found out that Taxol, which is a billion-dollar anti-cancer superstar drug, is not produced by the yew tree. It's produced by endophytes, that is, fungi that live inside the plant. So I suspect that this interrelationship between plants and fungi will become ever more evident as our science and technology gets better. But you look at 30,000 plants. Many of these plants have medicinal uses. Many of these medicines are combined plants. Many of these plants have to be collected a certain part of the phase of the moon or a certain soil type. And then how do you mix them? And then what's the dosage? So this is where this shamanic wisdom comes in. This is thousands and thousands and thousands of years of human experimentation. You look at Western medicine, we've kind of had maybe 200 years of human experimentation. So we're taking advantage of knowledge systems from which we can learn a lot. It's very important not to give the impression that I think that shamans know everything, but it's equally stupid to think that doctors know everything. Okay, the sweet spot's somewhere in between. So it's not the microchip or the medicine man. It's a combination of both. And when you look at the work we've done, which has actually been featured on Mongabay, how we did some of this rainforest mapping, in the early days, 20 years ago, you see guys in breechcloths with GPSs, which is essentially the combination or the perfect marriage of ancient shamanic wisdom and 21st century Western technology. Again, the sweet spot is this holistic approach where you're combining the best of both. So my worry in this psychedelic renaissance we're living in, I mean, people in Australia buy ayahuasca on the internet, but just because you can buy it on the internet and just because you can take it yourself doesn't mean you should. I mean, you wouldn't, do an operation on yourself. Why would you screw with these psychological scalpels? So I worry that the psychedelic renaissance is being oversold, that you can't do any harm to yourself. It's a natural product. What harm could come of it? Well, strychnos is a natural product too, right?
Here, Mark clarified to me after this conversation he was actually referring to strychnine, which is a highly toxic crystalline alkaloid, which, if ingested or absorbed, results in muscular convulsions and death by asphyxiation. It's derived from Strychnos nux vomica, which is a naturally occurring tree, but I agree with Mark. I don't think I'd want to ingest it. Yeah, you previously mentioned in your interviews with other podcasters like Tim Ferriss about this, this huge rise in ayahuasca usage, and how some folks are just going down into whether it's places where it's not actually traditionally from and using it from someone who's not trained in how to apply it. And there's a lot of horror stories I think that you could probably talk about. But I was actually kind of curious. There's so many negative things that have come with it, but I was wondering if you could talk about what are some of the positives that have come with this psychedelic renaissance, as you mentioned.
Well, there's undoubted positives. The most positive thing, it shows, yes, the rainforest is valuable medicinally. Yes, there's new things out there. Yes, the shamans know more about it than we do. Becoming a shaman is a much more prestigious thing in these cultures now than it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago, when the missionaries said shamans are bad and evil and stupid. So that's a good thing. It's put some money in the pockets of the shamans. It's encouraged kids to become shamans' apprentices. But there's no controls. I mean, if you go to a doctor's office, he or she's got an MD on the wall. Everybody says they're a shaman now. You know, people go to California and take ayahuasca for a weekend and say they're ayahuasca shamans. I talked to one of the primo guys in Colombia, right near where Schulte stumbled across ayahuasca in 1941. And I said, how long did it take you to learn to be an ayahuasca shaman? And he said, well, in your age, I'm 95 years old. He said, I'm still learning. And I said, is it true that, you start young, that you actually give ayahuasca to children? He said, absolutely not. I didn't start drinking until I was 5.
And in this respect, do you also believe that this rising interest in hallucinogens and this psychedelic renaissance and the traditional knowledge of them presents also a new opportunity for conservation? And if so, how?
I do. But again, it's a balance. I've had people say, I want to help the Indians, so I'm going to teach them how to grow more ayahuasca, because right now they're just collecting from the wild. Well, that's good. But, a whole shamanic culture is not one plant or one hallucinogen or one brew. So this over-focus on these things as the key worries me a bit. There's lots of finds coming out of the rainforest. There's nothing to do with hallucinogens. I'll give you an example. You mentioned Glenn Shepard, who's one of my favorite ethnobotanists. He told me about a plant they're using in Peru, which is called the ghost plant, which you rub in your eyes to give you more visual acuity, which sounds sort of counterintuitive. And he said in the old days, when they were hunting with a bow and arrow, this was, a question of well-being and feeding your family. Well, now they're hunting with a shotgun, so that's not so important. But they're using it before they play soccer. So this may not revolutionize the treatment of PTSD, but it means there's some chemical in there that we need to understand and study and commercialize only with the permission of the indigenous peoples and only if they benefit first and foremost.
I can't remember which show you said it on, but you were in a podcast interview and you talked about this sort of nagging injury that you had with your foot and yes. How, can you tell that story? Can you repeat that story? Because I found it incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, I did a TED Talk in Rio about 10 years ago. It's still up on the internet. And I talked about the fact that I went into this village where I've been working for a long time. And the shaman said, what's up? You're limping. And I said, I hurt my foot. And I went to the doctor and she gave me a bunch of meds and it didn't work. And she gave me a cortisone shot and it didn't work. And he said, take off your shoe and give me a machete. Seems scarier in retrospect,
right.
But I did. And he went over to a palm tree 3 meters away and scraped a fern off the bark, threw it in the fire, applied it to my foot, then threw the fern in a pot of water and had me drink it. Now, within minutes, essentially, my foot stopped hurting. And it came back 7 months later, and I went back to the shaman, and it didn't bother me for 10 years. So, ironically, you should ask, because I've injured my other foot. I'm going to see the shaman next month.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, I hope you feel better soon. I certainly, I've had a nagging back injury that I was like, maybe I should go see a shaman.
You should. I don't know if you know John Sarno's book. Sarno was a famous back surgeon in New York City. And just as a matter of curiosity, at one point he took, I think it was like 50 cadavers and cracked their back. Half of them were people who had back pain and half of them were people who didn't have back pain. And what he found was about half the people with back pain had nothing wrong with them organically, and half the people without back pain did have something wrong with them. The point being that sometimes an injured back is damaged muscles or damaged vertebrae, and sometimes it's emotional, and sometimes it's both. So I think this is why back pain is such a nagging, no pun intended, issue in our culture, because there's an emotional component, at least as part of it or all of it in some cases, and also because we're not adapted to be sitting in front of a computer on Zoom to the length we do. I mean, we're adapted to be running across the savannah of East Africa, either chasing gazelles or being chased by lions. And so considering how much time we spend sitting down these days, I think there's a whole host of problems and aches and pains that come from this unnatural but admittedly comfortable pose.
That is a very good point, and it may explain why I feel my best when I'm running. But I want to switch gears and talk about sort of like over the past few years, particularly, it seems like psychedelics or the aspects of like fungi, the medicinal aspects of fungi have seemed to sort of, garnered this renewed interest. And it seems like it's taken a really long time to get here. And some of these subjects have been demonized, especially like in the United States. Do we still have some similar hurdles of this, perception to overcome to make more forward progress in this field?
Well, again, to continue with the scalpel analogy, these are substances which can help and which can hurt. And it worries me when I see the sacred medicines commercialized, because that's sort of counterintuitive to what the indigenous peoples developed them for. But if it makes them more available in a more reliable form to help people, that's all to the good. But if it makes them more available for kids to screw with and screw up their brains, that's not good. And Michael Pollan, in one of his recent books, talked about the fact that you get these people who are emotionally troubled, not getting relief from their psychiatrist, their physician, and they go down to the Amazon and take ayahuasca. Now, some of them get better. Some of them die. Some of them get worse. So again, this whole idea that this is the panacea, it's not. But the same token, the flip side of the scalpel is you look at Chuck Nichols at LSU Medical Center in my hometown in New Orleans, and he's taking tiny doses of hallucinogens and finding some successful leads for asthma. So it doesn't seem to have anything to do with, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, but these are biodynamic principles that cause changes in the body. So it's endlessly fascinating, but it needs to be dealt with with respect and maybe a little bit of fear sometimes. And that's why I always say on the podcast, do it with a guide, do it with a shaman, because you need those guardrails. And the idea that taking mushrooms is like, smoking a joint or drinking a beer. It's not. Okay, you're fiddling with the software here. And you really need somebody on whose assistance you can call on if you get stuck. And believe me, I've had a few bad trips. I talked about one of them in my book, Medicine Quest, where it was bad. It was dark. I was vomiting purple phosphorescent scorpions. Ugh. And I don't think that's something most people want to end up doing. I certainly don't. So
No.
That's why you need a shaman to pull you back from the brink. And that's why just saying, hey, let's have a party and, do ayahuasca. I don't think that's a good idea.
Right. Well, and speaking of that sort of, having someone along there to guide you, obviously ayahuasca isn't the only plant-based psychedelic out there. And there's plenty of others to talk about that, which we could highlight. But I was wondering if you could talk a bit about Yopo, and specifically, the cultures and communities that introduced you to Yopo.
Well, Yopo simply means snuff. And you find it primarily in the Colombian Amazon, in the Venezuelan Amazon, and adjacent Brazil. But my favorite Yopo, which a lot of people don't get, is Varola. Varola is a nutmeg tree. I was asked recently at the Society for Economic Botany what's my favorite tree, and without pause, I was able to say Varola. Varola is one of the most beautiful trees in the Amazon. It's actually a popular timber tree, but it produces a red exudate, which is dried, crushed, and made into Yopo. The flip side of that, it's also used to paint on fungal infections of the skin. And if you live in the rainforest and you can't cure fungal infections of the skin, in some cases you are a fungal infection of the skin. So Schultes did the seminal work on Yopo on the Brazil side of the border with the Yanomami. And to complement his work in the mid-'80s, when I was looking for a thesis field site, I went to spend time with the Yanomami on the Venezuela side of the border. And man, that's where I got introduced to Yopo in a big way. Now, there's something else which has become popular in the interim called rape, R-A-P-E, with an accent ascending over the E. Make sure you use the accent. But that seems to be primarily a tobacco snuff. And so it is not hallucinogenic unless you take it in titanic amounts like Glenn Shepard talks about with the Matsugenga in the Peruvian Amazon. So there's a bit of confusion about exactly what Yopo is, kind of a generic term. But I like the real rainforest Yopo prepared by my Yanomami colleagues and teachers.
So I wanted to go ahead and switch gears and talk about your conservation work and
Mhm.
and talk about some of your opinions on what needs to happen to help preserve traditional knowledge, preserve the Amazon rainforest. What are your thoughts on like the state of things and what needs to happen now?
The frustrating thing to me as a rainforest conservationist is we know what the answers are, and we know what we should be doing, and we know what we shouldn't be doing, but we keep doing it. The whole idea that conservation comes down to a cost benefit analysis, and explain to me why so many Americans vote against their economic self interest. Okay, so the idea that human beings are logical creatures and always do the right thing and do what's best for them is simply not true. So the rainforest, it's like peace in the Middle East. We know what the outlines are. Okay, we know that there's the makings of a deal, but the devil's in the details. What should we do in the Amazon? We should follow what E.O. Wilson said to do: 50% protected, 50% to be used for other purposes. When I spoke to a Brazilian environment minister a couple of years ago, I said, "Here's the good news: you've already done the hard work. Half the Brazilian Amazon is in protected areas. Just protect it." Okay. I don't want to hear about, oh, we need jobs. And then they do this type of intensive agriculture, which creates very few jobs, right? It's all mechanized, just like here. And then it poisons the rivers and the land and destroys the forest. Why are we allowing people to do that when a very few people in New York or Sao Paulo get rich and everybody else, the Indians, are left with nothing? The peasants are left with nothing. And so we keep making these mistakes, not just in the rainforest, not just in Brazil, throughout the world. Even in this country, here in the U.S., even in Australia, people keep making stupid, destructive things because somebody's making money, right? So what should we do? Protect the half that's protected, manage it better. How do we do that? Again, it's very easy in theory. You map it, you manage it, you protect it. And those aren't just words and theoretical concepts. The Amazon Conservation Team, of which I'm the head, amazonteam.org, has partnered with over 100 indigenous groups throughout South America, mostly in the Amazon, but people like the Kogis on the Caribbean shore, to teach them how to map their lands. We don't map their lands, okay? We ride shotgun. They map the lands. Once you have a map, it's sort of an incipient management plan. You get to turn into a management plan, which is something that you have to teach them how to do because very few indigenous groups in South America know how to do their own management plan. And then you protect it. We run the longest indigenous park guard force in the Amazon that I know of. We're running a park guard force in the Northeast Amazon for over 12 years. That's proof of concept.
What Mark is referring to here when he mentions an indigenous-led park guard force in the Northeast Amazon includes the country of Suriname, where the ACT trains indigenous community members who carry out environmental monitoring in the forest surrounding their villages. The ACT states on their website that as of 2022, there are 39 active rangers across 8 villages.
So this could be done anywhere, and this could be done by the pygmies. Okay, this could be done in the boreal forest of Canada. It's not just about the Amazon. Very simple approach. Can't be a cookie cutter. Just have the outlines where each tribe does it their own way, or peasant communities for that matter. We're now working with peasant communities in the Colombian Amazon because you can't just deal with indigenous peoples. If the peasant peoples, with the Western mindset, it's all about cattle, deforestation, and intensive agriculture. So there's ways of building bridges between indigenous peoples, peasant peoples, campesinos in Colombia, caboclos in Brazil, and the forgotten people of the Amazon, which are the Afro-Amazonians. A lot of people in the Amazon are Black, okay? But nobody's talking about them. Nobody has programs developed them. In my experience, which is a long one in Brazil, in Suriname with the Maroons, they have their own belief system, they have their own culture, they have their way of utilizing and protecting the forest, and we need a program aimed at them in addition to programs aimed at indigenous peoples and peasant people, because they're not the same and they're being overlooked.
At the time, I believe in the 1990s, when you started working with the Amazon Conservation Team, your approach to conservation, which is that of community led, where indigenous communities are in the driver's seat of the conservation, it was sort of seen, I think, as like a pioneering approach. And nowadays, it feels like more and more people and NGOs are waking up to this. And
you're wrong. It wasn't seen as a pioneering approach. It was seen as a nutty approach. How do people say, "Are you crazy? You can't do that. Indians shoot monkeys and they cut down the rainforest. They're not conservationists." So that's what we had to deal with at the outset. But yes, you're right. A lot more people have come around to that.
A lot more people have come around to it now, but still, it feels like some are dragging their feet a little bit, or maybe some states are dragging their feet on it. I was just kind of curious to hear your perspective on whether or not this gives you a lot of hope for conservation, and if so, where are you seeing some real change taking place?
There's a great saying in Suriname: to every complicated question, there's an answer which is both simple and wrong. So the idea that, okay, we recognize indigenous peoples as the best stewards, okay, that's an important part of the equation, but it's not the only equation. Part of the problem now is enormous amounts of money flowing in some places and not well stewarded, okay? Giving people that were born in the Stone Age untold amounts of money can have a happy ending, but not usually. So that I don't want to sound patronizing, like, I know what to do and they don't. But I see this movement where people say, just give them the money and get out of the way. Well, you've got a grand total of one indigenous person in the Amazon that has an MBA from a foreign university. One, okay? So it's essential that a lot of this money goes into training so they can manage these projects and this money and stuff like that. So the idea that we just give these guys the money and get out of the way, it's just too simplistic. Now, some people won't like hearing it, but that's my impression and opinion. The other thing is that the modernity is pressing in on all sides. The younger generations are more involved in the cash economy, which is fine, but it also means they're more involved in the cash economy. So you can't assume that just handing over title means there isn't going to be a chainsaw sale. So that has to be part of the discussion. Now, these people should be able to do what they want with their lands, but it's our job, you and me and Mongabay and ACT and everybody else, to help them make informed decisions, because there's no shortage of people showing up, waving money and saying, just sign this and you'll be rich and live happily ever after, or missionaries still that show up in the rainforest and say everything you know is wrong and accept my belief system, put on pants, and you'll go to heaven.
Okay, so I have one more question here for you in regards to medicinal knowledge of plants, and it feels like to me there's a little bit of an untapped potential for the medical sector to really dive more into research here. It just feels like it's not happening, at least not at a pace that warrants the sort of things that we're finding out now. Do you think there's more of a role for the medical sector to play in championing conservation and study of the medicinal properties of these plants?
Well, there is and there isn't. If you look at it in terms of, or through the prism of the psychedelic renaissance, you have programs at Harvard, Yale, NYU, Berkeley, King's College in London, and on and on and on and on, focusing on these hallucinogens. So that's important. That's a step forward. But the hallucinogens are a handful of plants compared to the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plants that are used for medicinal purposes. So once again, it's a positive step, but it's a baby step compared to what should be doing. However, it can only be done in a way which reciprocity is first and foremost. How do we benefit these people first and foremost? None of this, give me your hallucinogen and I'll be back in 12 years with a lot of money for you if it gets through the FDA. Those types of approaches are long passé.
So what approach do you think should be happening now?
Well, we need more enlightened peoples and companies to sit down with indigenous peoples in true partnership and hammer out agreements and then test some of these things. But it only has to be if the indigenous peoples want to do it. I mean, we have this idea that these indigenous peoples running around the rainforest trying to escape these pharmaceutical companies. It's not the case. There's not much interest, like you said. So I think there's room for enlightened medicinal research and investigations based on what shamans know. And the way forward is clear, but people aren't doing it. So it goes back to your point about, well, why don't we just protect the rainforest because we all know we should? When I got in this business 40 years ago, people said to me, this is a quote, Who gives a shit about the rainforest? We have to worry about population growth. And once we settle that, then we can deal with the rainforest. Now, I've had somebody say to me recently, who gives a shit about the rainforest? We have to worry about climate change. Well, of course, population growth is destroying the rainforest, which is driving climate change. So as the shamans would say, it's all connected. It's all the same thing.
All right, Mark. Is there anything else that you're working on with Amazon Conservation Team, or something you want to plug about your podcast?
Well, another thing that I think is often overlooked is the role of women. We find that it's essential to work with the women of these tribal communities. But what a lot of people don't get is that can be the most difficult aspect. Certainly in the most traditional groups I've worked with, as a male, I can't work with the females until I've sort of proven myself, which took 10 years. Okay. So this idea that you just waltz in and say, I'm here to help the women, you guys just kind of piss off, is way too simplistic. On the other hand, when we started mapping, we did all the mapping with the guys in the tribes because that's who we were allowed to work with. Now we go back and work with the women. We train them in mapping, and women hold a different landscape in their head. So we kind of missed half the equation. So I haven't seen programs devoted to conservation of rainforest cultures focusing on the women and their knowledge, because it's complementary to working with the men, and most of the groups that I know work with the men. So it shouldn't be one or the other, but the idea that if you work with the men, you've protected the tribe and the culture in the rainforest is not true. We at the Amazon Conservation Team just worked in partnership with women of the ayahuasca culture in the Colombian Amazon, with the support of the Colombian government, with the support of Tim Ferriss, to set up a women's ayahuasca rainforest, because they use their own herbs, which are different than what the men use. They focus on childbirth and kids and stuff like that. So their ethnopharmacopoeia is not entirely the same as it is with the men. And I think we need to see more like that rather than less.
All right, Mark. Where can people find information on Plants of the Gods or on Amazon Conservation Team?
Yeah, Plants of the Gods podcast is available on all major platforms, Apple Podcast, anywhere you find most podcasts. In terms of the Amazon Conservation Team, we are on the web at amazonteam.org. And I have a personal webpage, markplotkin.com, with some of my writings, like the Ethnobotany of Warfare, the Ethnobotany of Wine, that aren't really rainforest stuff, but complement it. So there's actually been some wonderful articles in our work on Mongabay.com, so people can look us up there as well.
And I will definitely link those articles in the show notes. Mark Plotkin, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
My pleasure, and I look forward to doing it again.
If you want to check out Mark's podcast, Plants of the Gods, you can find it on the podcast provider of your choice or by clicking the link here in the show notes. Also linked in the show notes is a previous conversation we've had with Mark, published last year. And as always, if you enjoy the Mongabay newscast and you want to help us out, you can spread the word by telling a friend about the show, because that's the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. But you can also help us out by leaving a review on the platform you're tuning in on. But if you want, you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so even just $1 per month really helps us offset the production costs. If you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, go to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either App Store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to all of our shows and previous episodes. As always, you can read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, find Mongabay on most of the social platforms out there, including Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Mastodon. Or you can find us at mongabay.org on Twitter. Thanks, as always, for listening.